Thank you for the opportunity to go and speak. And I love the WLIA, so it gives me another chance to go and see if we can continue this conversation. So, in our experience with clients, and it's not just in WLIA, this is all across the country, we found that there's certain similarities throughout this. And the similarities seem to be that people go into parcel mapping with this thought process that, oh, parcels are pretty simple, right? Really, because all they are their polygons. And all you have to do is locate the parcel boundaries and make them fit into the existing data. Well, those of us that actually are very familiar with all the intricacies of parcel mapping realize that there's a lot of misunderstanding in there, that maybe you don't understand all the complexity or all the depth of what parcel mapping really goes and takes into account. So what I want to try and do today is just sort of go over some of these background elements in here, see if we can get a better understanding of it, and some of the fundamental truths about land ownership on here. So let's start with this. There's several areas in which complexity is introduced. One is just this whole concept of land ownership. How do we in the United States own land? Secondly, there's a concept called livery of seizure that all of our land ownership is based upon. And I want to go and explain that a little bit more. Then I want to talk about this concept of monuments and what is a monument and what is it useful for and why do you want to look for monuments in here. Then we're going to talk about types of surveying, talk about interpretation of legal descriptions, sequential conveyances versus simultaneous conveyances, and why there's a difference between them and why, when you're mapping them, you handle things differently depending upon what type of a conveyance it is. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about remonumentation projects, something that's near and dear to everybody's heart up in Wisconsin. So let's start with ownership. It because the way we own the land is really misunderstood, at least by the general public for the most part, because we really don't own the land. What we actually own is we just own a right to use that land. It's really never about the physical ownership of it, but rather we have been conveyed through transactions the ability to use it for something. And most often when people talk about land ownership, you sort of have to show this in that the ownership is really nothing more than this bundle of rights in which we have a right to use the property, to build on the property, to grant easements, to let others use the property, to go and serve it as collateral for a mortgage. We have the ability to go and mine and drill and farm and to restrict the use of it, to put covenants upon it, to exclude others from using the property. We have the ability to sell this right. We have the ability to refuse to sell the right, to give it away, to abandon uses of it. We have the ability to rent it. We have the ability to lease it. We have the ability to provide someone else a license to use it. But it's always about the right that we have for the property. And this one concept, fee simple ownership, really is you have all of those rights except those rights which are reserved to the sovereign. And this gets back to Old England and how all these rights sort of came into being. Is originally the lord of the manor would go and grant to any of the servants the ability to use the property that he owned. And it's come into the United States when most of the original patents, most of the original conveyances of rights out of the United States government or out of the individual states, what we commonly call the sovereign, out of the sovereign, they never really give you all the rights. They only give you certain rights. For example, most of them always exclude the rights of the public on there. They exclude the ability to go and in some places here in Florida, They exclude the right to go and use what's underneath those rights that you have. So there's always some rights that are reserved for the general public on here. So again, it's not that we actually own the dirt as much as we own the rights to use that dirt. And when we're talking about parcel mapping, what we really are doing is we're actually attempting to go and identify what the limits of the right, and this is a little strange, what the right to pay taxes on that property is. And that right to pay taxes is very different from, oh, I can go and sell this right or anything. It basically just says that this entity, who is the entity that's responsible for paying any taxes which might be owed to the regulatory governments. So it is just a right to pay taxes that we are mapping out when we're going and mapping these things on here. So we get into, as we dig into this a little bit further, we get into all of these various types or gradations of land ownership. We have the sovereignty. The sovereignty, again, originally owned the land, they controlled the land, and then they started granting out all of these rights, with fee simple being the most complete that an individual can have. And then we go into things such as, well, there's an easement right. An easement right is a release or a granting of the right to use the property for a limited number of uses. So it might be an easement to a utility company, but that easement does not convey to that utility company every right. They can't necessarily build on it unless that's included and specifically stated in that document of conveyance. I have had an experience in which we went and granted in my previous occupation. I worked for a landowner who went and granted an easement to a utility company. That utility company then granted a permit to a different utility company to go and install piping in it. And in fact, the property owner had to go back to that first utility company and say, you were never granted that right. You need to go and discharge all of those permits, and they're going to have to come back to us and we're going to grant them another easement for it. So again, an easement doesn't convey to you or that party an unlimited amounts of right. It's a limited rights. Same way with a leasehold interest. A leasehold interest is really a limited time that you have the ability to use it for a limited purpose. But then as you get into this, you also have other more interesting types of land ownership. You have a percentage ownership. I have 50% of this property. This is really tough to start mapping. We can map the overall area, but how do we start building something which reflects that we may not have use of these rights for 100% of the time? It might only be a percentage of the time, or it may be temporal, where we have this in Florida a lot, and in which we have timeshares. How do you go and map an ownership in a unit where that's only 2 weeks out of a year? Does someone have a right to go and use that? They still get taxed for it, but how do you go and manage that? So mapping of land ownership is really not a simple thing. Again, when we start talking about individual ownership or sole ownership, and then joint ownership or co-ownerships with things such as joint tenancy or tenancy in entirety, or tenancy in common, or co-parency, there's complexion that which goes and gets introduced into this. All right, so it's not simple at all. It is not, oh, you just draw polygons and you're done with it. No. So let's talk about the way we actually convey interest in property. How do we actually do that? And if you look at all of our modern sort of procedures that we use, they all go back to this one concept, this concept of livery of season. And what livery of season means is that one person who is conveying this right to someone else delivers to them, which is the livery, the possession that they have, the season. All right. And matter of fact, here is in fact a plaque that's commemorating the landing place of William Penn, in which it talks as you go down through here. It says, he proceeded to the fort and performed livery of season. He took the key thereof, which was the main representation of that possession. He did deliver unto him one turf and a twig upon it, a porridge of water and soil in part of all. And this was always the tradition that occurred when someone was going to convey to someone else a piece of property. They would all meet on that property with a witness, and then they would go, and the owner of the property would go and walk around the boundary with the person who was purchasing it. And that person walking around the boundary would go and point out, the property that I am conveying to you starts here. And then we go along the road until we get to a certain place. Then we go and we'll turn and we'll go towards the river. And that tree is not on our property. This tree is on the property. And they would actually walk that entire boundary, the entire boundary. And then when they were done, they would reach down and pick up a piece of turf and a portion of the tree, and they would hand it to that other person. That other person would then go and take possession of that. And it would be with that acceptance of the turf and the twig that actually would go and seal the conveyance of the property. And if you look at what we do today, it's much like that. We no longer go out and meet on the property, but what we have is we have either a surveyor or we have somebody go and prepare a legal description that says you start here, you go along here, you come all the way around. What's included inside of this, that's the area that's being conveyed. And then you go and you take a deed that goes and says, I'm giving this to you. And it's the acceptance of the deed and the delivery of the goods, the money for it, that is the transfer of the twig and the turf that actually goes and commemorates the same transaction that's going on. This is where all of this starts, is the livery of season and how it goes about. And once you understand that, you begin to understand that there's importance in the way property is described. And there's importance for certain elements of that description. Because again, land is described by referencing monuments. That monument could be, as I was describing, that monument could in fact be the road that you were walking along, or it could be a tree, or it could be a stone wall, or it could be the river. But it was always this concept of referencing a monument that was in there. And it was only later that we began to introduce things such as maybe a direction, maybe a distance to go and do that. But it was always the monumentation. And if you actually go and look through this deed, this legal description in here, it looks actually like it's a very poorly written legal description, because it says things like the second paragraph here says, thence continue along the original property line of said nursery and along the approximate center line of said Murphy Road for bearing in a distance to a point on a curve concave to the southwest, actually concave to the northeast, having a radius of this, and it describes that a little bit further. But what you see in here is you see a lot of calls that are not measurement calls, but rather are what we call monument calls. In that first paragraph, I have highlighted and outlined in red the measurement call, but then I've underlined what the actual important calls are in this legal description. And it says, to the point of intersection of the west line of this addition to Gull Harbor, according to the plat thereof as recorded in this book and page of the county, said point being the intersection of the former southeast corner of Loxahatchee Nursery and lying on approximate center line of said Murphy Road, said point being also the point of beginning of the herein described right of way. That's where you start, not the directions, not the distance. It is those monument calls which really define where a piece of property is located. It is always the monuments that you're looking for, to the point where if you have a series of calls inside of a legal description, there's a priority of what actually holds on there. So if we look over all the way on the right, we have a legal description, a portion of the northeast quarter of section 14, containing 10 acres more or less, shown on that survey plat, dated June 9th, 1957, recorded in Plat Book 12, page 14 of the county's recorder offices. And if we start looking at all these monuments in that legal description, what it clearly does is it points out certain monuments that we need to look at. The first thing is, are there any natural monuments here? No. A natural monument is something like a river or a road, but it does point out artificial monuments, which are those corners that have been set with monuments by the original surveyors. And then it goes down and it calls out distances and bearings and finally acreage. So if you look at this list here, this is actually sort of the filter. What controls when you have a series of conflicting sets of information within a legal description? So for example, if I have something that says to the river, it doesn't matter what anything else says, it means to the river. Same way, if I have something that says beginning at this corner marked by this monument, or this corner as originally shown, that holds above bearings and distances or anything else. Interestingly also though, if I look through this, what about bearings and distances? It turns out that distances are weighted higher than bearings. Again, the bearings, because there's multiple datums, there's multiple types of ways of referencing north. Bearing is always less important than a distance is, but a distance is less important than an artificial monument that was originally established, and even that's less important than a natural monument. So as you're going through and looking to map a legal description, whether it's an adequate description or a meets and bounds description, you always want to keep in the back of your mind this priority of calls to monuments, and recognize if there's a conflict, which one is the highest priority? Which one should you be depending on when you're mapping this? And if you look, by the way, this is a subset of what the surveyors tend to use. Is the actual priority call for surveyors about twice this long. It actually goes into things such as the intent of the parties to the deed, whether or not there was any senior rights within those. There's more to it, but just for this discussion, I cut it down to this so we can really focus on how do you interpret that legal description in here. Notice again, acreage is dead last. You might have an acreage call just because it says specifically it's an acreage that really is only used if you've got nothing else to go and give you any information about this. So the next element we need to think of is that, remember, measurements are never perfect. Never, ever perfect. If you're going to throw something out, the first thing you want to throw out is a measurement, right? Because there are limits on precision. The way things were measured previously are not the way things are measured now. You have imperfect measuring tools. I recall when I first started surveying, the standard measuring tool was a 200-foot steel tape. Well, measuring here in Florida, you often would get into, especially in the summertime, where you get into temperatures where you'd be out there in 95, 100 degree. And during the day, as the temperature went up, that steel tape had elasticity built into it. So what you measured in the morning would measure differently in the afternoon, because that tape, that unit and tool that you were measuring with, had actually stretched a little bit. Same way with the steel tape, you could actually pull it. You could have two people, one on each end of it. You could actually pull it and stretch it. It's not quite as rigid as you think it is. You could actually stretch it out. So as you begin surveying with things like these imperfect measuring tools, you begin to understand the limitations of them. Things such as GPS, they all have limitations on them as far as how close they can actually measure. Just because something is measured by a GPS unit doesn't mean that it's actually a good, precise measurement. There are all sorts of elements in there. Things like terrain, whether or not there's difference in an elevation. Is a measurement being taken along a slope, or is it horizontal measurements that's going on there? The diligence of the surveyor, and I would add surveyor / crew. I can share with you that it really is dependent upon the people who are doing that measurement as far as how good a measurement actually occurs. And then finally, and this is most important, the results rarely match the original measurements that are either called out on the deed or even called out between observation sessions. They rarely match the same. And it's because of all these variants of time and heat and temperature and humidity and terrain and the crews that were doing the measurements. There's all sorts of changes that occur. So rarely do you get two crews measuring the same distance and coming up with exactly the same thing because of the imperfections. We're human. So, but the thing to remember on this slide is that measurements are never perfect. And just because they include a measurement in a legal description, that measurement, if you go back here, that measurement is far down the list of priority calls. And it should never be the primary thing that you use to go and locate a parcel. All right. So there's a concept here, and we're going to introduce this a little bit further, of the original survey. Where did something come from? When was it established? Because the legal concept that we have is that wherever a monument was placed originally, whether it was right or wrong from subsequent measurements and subsequent surveys, wherever a monument establishing legal rights was placed, that established where the limits of that property was. Interesting concept here, which in modern time we've flipped completely over. The original subdivision plat, or the original survey plat, was actually prepared after a surveyor went out and established the corners, which meant that he established the corners first, and then went and measured between them. But the interest was already established with placing a monument in the ground. That's where the interests were created. So that if they came back and tried to measure it and came up with something different, it didn't mean that the land had moved. It just meant that there was a different measurement between the monuments. The monuments that were created with the original surveyor, when he first set those corners in the ground or set the pins in the ground, they establish where the land is actually defined, even if the legal description is slightly off. Which means there's really only two kinds of surveys in the world. Those original surveys that actually are setting the monuments for the first time. And then every survey after that is a retracement survey or an attempt to figure out exactly where those original monuments were placed. In surveying, we have a sort of a code that says our efforts most of the time are purely on retracing the footsteps of the original surveyor. We should not be going out there and creating new corners. We always want to find the original corners so that when we come across something that says that it is, there's multiple corners within about a 4-inch radius, there's something wrong there. People have done something very wrong. to illustrate that, if we look at this, over on the left-hand side is the original survey plat done in 1957. And if you look, these symbols say that these were the property corners that were set with this survey. All right, and it said that this is 660 feet by 660 feet, and it contained 10 acres on here. Well, a retracement that was done after the fact found that, in fact, the difference between the monuments, it was not 660 feet north-south, but rather it was only 625 feet. That does not mean that the purchaser actually has 35 extra feet that goes into an adjoining property. It means that the monuments establish that. And if you look at, again, let's go back here, what controls the location of this? It is the artificial monuments which were established. And then below that, the distances are subject to where those original monuments are located. So that, sorry about that. That's what happens when I don't look at where I'm pushing my button. So that it turns out those original monuments, even though they had not been placed in compliance with that original survey, they don't get moved. They are always there wherever they put it. Two types of surveys: original survey, even if it is, I'm using big air quotes here, even if it is wrong, wherever that original surveyor put that monument in the ground, that's where it is. So almost all surveys now are retracements, which means that almost all mapping that occurs, because in many ways, parcel mappers are really nothing more than retracement surveyors. You are constantly looking to figure out not what the bearings and distances are and whether or not they fit, but what's the best indication of where the original corner or property was located. You're not supposed to attempt to create overages and shortages and the bearings and distances, which is called out on a legal description, are really nothing more than guides to get you in the general direction. All right, legal descriptions. There really are only three types of legal descriptions. One is what we call an aliquot. An aliquot is a French word for portion of or proportion of, in which one acquires a proportionate amount of the original. Then there's a meets and bounds description. Meets and bounds description is more like livery of season, in which you actually describe the boundary of the property. The meets being the courses or the bearings and distances, and the bounds being the actual monument references that are being called out on there. But you want to pay, if you've got a legal description that's a meets and bounds description, you want to pay special attention to the monuments in there. And there's a little hint: when you read a legal description and you see the word, a meets and bounds description, and you see the word to or along, those two words mean there's a monument call right after that, and you want to pay special attention to that monument call, because no matter what it said before then, that monument goes and defines where you should actually be mapping this. And then the third type of legal description is what's commonly called a graphical description, in which the breakdown is actually represented by a graphic, which is recorded in the public records, supposedly recorded in the records. There's a lot of unrecorded subdivisions out there, but what you do is in here, you actually consider everything that's on the graphics. If there's a shortage or an overage in here, you determine by what's shown on a graphic how to go and spread the excess or deficiency within that graphic. You know, are there dimensions that are omitted? All right. So, and we'll look at those things in a little bit, but here's one of the things that you want to look at is there is a difference between what's called a sequential conveyance and a simultaneous conveyance. And the difference has an impact on how we go and distribute any overages or shortages amongst them. So a sequential conveyance means that there's been a lapse of time between conveyances. You know, Farmer Brown goes and sells the east half of his property to Farmer Jones, and then Farmer Brown goes and sells the remaining portion of his property with a separate description. All right. So what really occurs here is what's commonly called junior senior rights. The junior rights are once you convey out something to that new parcel, you can never sell anything of that original parcel you sold out again. You can only sell what you own at the moment. You can only sell what you own at the moment. So if there's something sold out, you can't come back and write a legal description that goes into that parcel again because you've already sold it out. All right. That's a sequential conveyance, so that any differences between the measurements that you have for it and what you actually find out there are subject to junior and senior rights. If you've already sold out everything, the only thing you can sell is what is left. All right. However, if everything was created at the same time in what's commonly called a sequential or a simultaneous conveyance, these parcels were created at the same moment of time, such as lots in a subdivision or sections in a public land survey system. You know, a PLSS government township plat is actually a simultaneous conveyance. And when you look at distributing overages or shortages, it's always through some sort of proportional distribution of that overages or shortage. Each is entitled to a proportionate share of the original because they were created at the same time. That's the reason why if you've been using the local government information model, you see that subdivisions are usually called simultaneous conveyances. And it's because you look at those simultaneous conveyances, and that gives you a hint on how you go and manage any overages or shortages. It measures long, it measures shorts, those sorts of things. Simultaneous conveyance is always a proportional share. Sequential conveyance is always junior, senior rights. You can't sell what you don't own anymore. All right. So excess and deficiency. When we look at this simultaneous conveyance, we have these lots along this block that are all called out on that graphic as being 50 feet wide. But when we actually go out there and measure it, it doesn't measure out to 250 feet, which should be the total of those, measures out as 249 and a half. So what happens is that deficiency between that actually gets distributed equally. You know, the lot at the end doesn't get shorted a half a foot. Rather, they all get shorted a tenth of a foot in here. All right. This is a standard sort of proportioning throughout there. But it becomes more difficult when you start looking at older plats. And this is where you want to be careful when you're looking at the plat and notice that there are some plats where they just left off the dimensions. They left off some of the dimensions in here. And in this plat specifically, when I look at this, it says that all of these curves, it really doesn't give you any dimension on any of these curves in here. When I look at that, it immediately tells me that any excess or deficiency is distributed within those lines that are not dimensioned. It is not a proportional because it doesn't define what the overall proportion is on these. Similarly, and this is sort of the indication that you get sometimes, is that on an older plat, it may not have dimensions on every single line. It may have Generally, these are proposing or supposed to be parallel to one another. Notice there's dimensions in here. And this gets into a tricky part. Well, if you have a deficiency or an overage along between, 25th Street and the street up on the north here, how do you distribute it? Does it all get distributed to the individual lot frontages? Or does it also get distributed to within the road rights of way? And I've had some interesting discussions with this, and I think the consensus is it depends upon who's doing the mapping. If you've got tax parcels, maybe you want to go in and map those original tax parcels where they reflect what's of record, and any overages or shortages are thrown into the public lands there, the road rights of way. And I've also had a discussion with government agencies who are mapping road rights of way, and they say, no, 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 no. It should be equally distributed between any ownership within there, whether it's a public entity or a private entity. There is no real consensus on how to do this. We do know that it's a simultaneous conveyance. There should be some proportional distribution on here, but which of these lines actually participate in that proportion? There's no real consensus on that. I just included this here only just to note that this is a surveyor's notes on a subdivision plat that they were going at and remapping. And I thought this interesting because this is a good indication of the type of monument calls and the type of references that a surveyor might have as far as, okay, here there's a building in here that's references, there's a cross cut in the right of way here in here. So there's a monument called in here. Here's where the roads are. So it's always references to monument calls as they're attempting to go and figure out where something is supposed to go. Nail cuts in the concrete along this property here. It's always about finding those monuments and determining whether or not those monuments are record monuments, meaning whether they are the original monuments or whether they came afterwards. Because everything goes back to the original monuments in here. In this lower right corner, you see here what we often call a pin cushion corner, in which you've had subsequent surveyors, none of them being willing to go and accept the location of a monument as being that's the original monument. So they all felt the need to go and establish their own. This is not good practice. This is not good practice. Other than that, you see some samples of original monuments. Most original monuments, especially as it relates to the public land survey system, were materials that were available in the area. In the center, you see this, what looks like a wood post in the middle of some greenery. This is actually a sample of what we see down here in Florida, because there weren't really rocks down here in Florida, and there weren't that many stones down here in Florida. We're primarily swampland. Instead, what the original surveyors would do is they would go and chop down a cypress tree. And at the heart of a cypress tree is a very oily, an oily heart that does not go and decay very much. So they would go and strip that cypress tree and create what was called a lighter wood post. There's actually heavy oils inside of this post. And these lighter wood posts, I did most of my field surveying back in the 70s and 80s, which was close to 100 years after the original lighter wood posts were established. And I actually found some lighter wood posts out there in some of these original monuments for some section corners in there. So these lighter wood posts are resistant to decay, and you still find them every once in a while. They're becoming very rare, though, only because they're being replaced by concrete monuments from private surveyors and county surveyors. But again, for the most part, they used whatever materials were available at that time. So let's come to Justice Thomas Cooley. And I have here, by the way, a link. And if you want to send me an email afterwards, I'll go and I'll get you a copy of it. Justice Cooley went and made a speech to a group of surveyors in Wisconsin. I think it was 1881. And he was talking about what it was that surveyors, and I've actually included in here mappers, what they should be thinking about when they're doing, when they're going and attempting to generate a map of where something is located. And it basically says that surveyors, and again, I introduce mappers, are not and cannot be judicial officers, but in a great many cases, they act in a quasi-judicial capacity with the acquiescence of parties concerned. And it's important for them to know that by what rules they are guided in the discharge of their judicial functions. It basically means that you shouldn't be creating new land interests by just thinking, oh, I can just draw out with the measurements and go and put it where it is. By the way, this Dropbox link actually takes you to the actual transcript of the entire presentation. And it includes some very interesting components in here. This one here, I went and highlighted. And he talks about extinct corners and what it's meant. And you know, but if by extinct corners meant one in respect to the actual location of which all reliable evidence is lost, then the following remarks are pertinent. There would undoubtedly be a presumption in such a case that the corner was correctly fixed by the government/original surveyor where the field is indicated to be. But this is only a presumption. It may be overcome by any satisfactory evidence showing that, in fact, it was placed elsewhere. So the presumption is always that they did it correctly. Number 3, no statute shall convey upon a county surveyor the power to establish corners and therefore bind the parties concerned. Nor is this a question merely of conflict between state and federal law. It's a government of property right. It's a question of property right. The original surveys must govern, and the laws under which they were made govern, because the land was bought in reference to them. The land was bought in reference to the original monuments. And any legislature, whether state or federal, that shall have the effect to change this would be inoperative because of the disturbance to vested rights. Cooley's dictum is often referred to as letting sleeping dogs lie. All right? You don't go in and disturb everything just because you think, oh, this fits better than what I actually see out there. In any case of disputed lines, unless the parties concerned settle the controversy by agreement, the determination is necessary is a judicial act, and it must proceed upon evidence and give full opportunity for hearing. So be careful when you're establishing your tax maps, because they're relied upon by the general public, and that general public thinks, whether you actually do or not, but they think that you have the authority to tell them where they own property. All right, you want to be very, very careful with this. All right, and go in here. So what does it have to do with Wisconsin? Wisconsin's got a lot of remonumentation projects, and there's actually a Bureau of Land Management whole guide on remonumentation projects, and it lays out, first, the boundaries of the public lands when approved and accepted are unchangeable. All right, and you want to be careful about this. And I'm going to go down through, but what does it mean for the remonumented corners that you have? And this is the important part. The monuments that are used for the original creation of the real interest should be used for mapping of the land. So if a monument was used, if a 1985 monument was used to go and record a CSM or a subdivision plat, and that monument was used to establish those interests in the property, Just because you think there's a better location for it doesn't mean that that CSM should be remonumented or remapped, because all those people that bought land in there relied upon those original monuments that were established to define where they actually own. In other words, as it relates to remonumented corners, sometimes you use those old monuments that you know and think are not in the right place, and sometimes you use the new ones. It depends upon when the land interest is being created and what's going on there. All right, so this is, I love this. This was like a week ago. I saw this in the news that a Belgian farmer was going and plowing his fields, and he hit against a monument and it was in his way. So what he did is he picked up the monument and he moved it 7 feet. Well, it turns out that that monument was the monument between Belgium and France. And the question is, by moving the monument, did he actually move the country boundaries? Did he redefine the country boundaries? And the answer is no. It always goes back to where the original monument was placed by the original surveyors. Not where the monument is now, but where it was originally replaced. So that the remonumentation projects that you have going on, those are really good projects in attempting to find where those original monuments were placed. All right. But that doesn't mean you go back and remap everything because you think you know where those original monuments were placed with the PLSS. You need to take into consideration when land interests were created, because you don't want to disturb those sleeping dogs. You want to let them lie. You want to keep them in peace and don't disturb the entire neighborhood. It may need some really weird configurations, but just be careful when you're going and doing these monuments. Remember, it always comes back to the monument. Where was that monument placed? And I've talked to my team and other people, and it's like, you know, we kind of do ourselves a disservice by saying, oh yeah, we're just mapping it, and it seems like it's a very modern thing to do. But the reality is, all too often, we can almost be thought of as being forensic mappers. We are always looking backwards to figure out, where was that original monument? What was the original monument? Can we still find that original monument? Do we still understand what the intent was? Do we understand what the senior rights and junior rights are when we're creating this? Do we understand, is this a simultaneous conveyance or not? There's a lot that goes into parcel mapping that is not obvious when you first look at it. All right, that is my presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. Just to let you know, in 2 weeks, I'm actually giving an expanded one and actually opening up. It's going to be at Panda Consulting's Deep Dive workshop, and it'll be a little bit expanded on this. Every time I went through there was more things I wanted to put in here, but we are going to go in and do that again. So I know we don't have a whole lot of time. Carmen or Shelley, do we have any questions?
I don't see anything right now. Joe, did you get your question answered by Eric in the chat?
Yeah, that was sufficient. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just looking through the now because I didn't pay much attention to it. Yeah, Eric, you're right. You know, a lot of people swear by Brown's boundary, and you got to realize that there's always nuances in there, and the priority of calls are a general guide. You always go back to individual citations of case law. The actual rules for surveying and for establishing these are dependent upon case law. And just to let you know, when you're looking at case law, you have to recognize that there's local case law and there's law that's been through state courts, and there's law that's been all the way up to the federal courts. As you go further, the local laws tend to favor equity. They try to do things that are fair. And as you move up through the appellate courts, the higher and higher the courts are, they get more and more closer to rules and how to do it correctly. Whereas the lower courts tend to, again, they tend to favor equity over really following or establishing a new law that might be cited. Anything else? Streets are normally fixed boundaries per width on plat, litigating. Yep. Again, it depends upon, Brett, it depends. Sometimes they are proportioned, even though they're often, again, it depends on who's doing the mapping in there. All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for listening to me on this. Any other questions, just go ahead and shoot me an email or give me a shout out. I'm very thankful for the chance to do this. Let's hope that next time we do this in person. And let's enjoy the rest of this session. Thank you.